Hello mate, and welcome to another exciting video. This one is going to be a very long one because this is the intro to Ren'Py Masterclass. The plan of this video is to take you from a complete novice who's never used Ren'Py before up to a level where you should be able to create some pretty cool functions in your game and create a really awesome visual novel. Much like all of my other series, I'm going to walk you through everything step by step and talk you through things, and I'm going to put as little waffle in there as possible so that every minute of the video hopefully is providing you with useful information. Unlike the competition. Alright, so let's jump into this then. So the first thing you need to do is download Ren'Py. So what you have to do is visit a website called ren'py.org and download the latest version and install it. Once you've done that, then you will be able to run Ren'Py and you will get a window much like this one. Now, if you've never used Ren'Py before, I would highly recommend downloading the latest version, which is Ren'Py 8, because it uses Python 3. If you use a prior version to that, then you might end up being stuck with a version of Python such as 2.7, which isn't the end of the world. Certainly most of my tutorials up until this point have been done with previous versions, but Python 3 just has so much more cool functionality and it would be daft not to use it to the best of our abilities. Okay, so what you're going to see when you open up Ren'Py for the first time is you're going to see the tutorial and the question. So what we can do is, if we were to have a look in the question, for example, when we look at the text within the file, you can see that there are two defined statements at the top, a default statement and then a thing called a label, and then a whole bunch of commands right afterwards. So before we do anything else, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the anatomy of all of these commands so that we can see what's actually being said. Now, if you ignore all of the tabs at the top, they're from a different project that I'm working on. What I'm using to edit my text with at the moment is Atom. However, Atom has now been sunset, so what you might want to do is download Visual Studio Code and use that as your preferred text editor. It does have a Ren'Py module that you can attach to it to enable you to get your commands and so on. So you don't necessarily have to use that. You can use Atom, but as I said, Atom is being sunset, which means that there's not going to be support for it for much longer. So our commands. The first command's up here where it says define s equals character Sylvie color, and then we think, right, well, what the hell does that do? So what we need to do at the very beginning of our game, before we run any of our story code, what we have to do is tell Ren'Py who the characters are. And we use that using a define statement. A define statement means that once we create this variable, it cannot be changed afterwards. So we're saying that define, so the variable s is a value that we're going to use to reference that character in future. Then we're saying it is a character, the character's name is Sylvie, and her nameplate, when the text appears on the screen, will be this color. This is hexadecimal color. Now you can either have it being 3 characters long, 6 characters long, 4 characters long, or 8 characters long. Now don't worry too much about what they all mean at the moment. Suffice to say that if you want a specific color, you can go onto Google and you can search for hex color picker, and then there are various different options that you can choose from, and what they usually have is a kind of color wheel or a color palette that you can choose a color from, and then it will actually tell you what the hex value is. So you don't have to spend hours trying to figure out what those colors all are yourself. You can just use that instead. Okay, so in this case we've defined 2 characters, Sylvie and me, and then I've been assigned a slightly different color to Sylvie. The next thing we've done is we've set a variable called book to be a Boolean variable. Now Boolean variables are either true or false. It's like a binary thing in that if the value can either be true or false, that's it. And we use those to check whether certain conditions have been met or not. Now the word default means that this character, or this variable, sorry, will be false by default, but we can change it later on. And this is just a shorthand way or a quick way of defining variables so that if we reference them later in the script, we don't get a crash if we forget to tell the game what that variable is at any given point. Excuse me. So that's what that does. The next bit where it says label start. Now, label is a block of code that we can call. So for example, let's imagine that this box contains code that I want to run, and I might want to run it more than once. So rather than having to write the contents of this box many times, what I do is I say this box contains the code. I'm going to call this box start. And now if I want to run this code multiple times, all I have to do is say call the start label again. And we can do that with as many different labels as we want. As you can see, we've got label right away here, label game, label book, label marry. So we've got a number of labels there that can be called or jumped to, and we'll get to what that means in a moment. The next command is play music. So it's actually going to play some music, funnily enough, and that is the file name of the file that we're going to play. The next thing it says is scene BG lecture hall with fade. So I've opened up my file explorer here so that you can see what's going on actually inside the folder for the question tutorial. And inside the question folder there is a folder called game, and that's basically where you want to put all of your files. So for example, the ilyurok.opus file that it played as music just up here is contained within the game folder, and you can see that when we actually tell Ren'Py the file that we want to play, we don't add any file extensions or anything to the beginning or any directory tree there. It's just ilyurok.opus, and that's because Ren'Py is automatically going to look straight into the game folder for that particular file. Now, where it says scene BG lecture hall, we don't have any quotation marks or a file extension. Why is that, I hear you cry? I'm so glad you asked. So if we come into our images folder, you will see that we have a number of images, and BG lecture hall is an image with .jpeg at the end of it. Now, the cool thing that Ren'Py does to make your life so much easier is that when you start the game, when you start your game, it will search through the images folder and it will take any image file of a file format that Ren'Py can use, for example JPEG or WebM and so on, and it will create a variable within your game that contains the file folder and everything that you need, so that all you have to do is say either show or scene and it will display the image. And this will happen with anything that is contained within a subfolder of the images folder as well. So if I was to create a folder in here called chicken and then put a chicken.jpg inside the chicken folder, rather than being called chicken/chicken, the file would simply be called chicken. So I can call it like that, okay? So that's quite a cool feature of Ren'Py. So scene BG lecture hall is just telling us to display that image on the screen. That's all it's doing. Now, the difference between scene and show, which you can see is a command that's used down here, the difference between the two is that scene will also clear the dialog window and everything else from the screen. It will literally just clear the entire slate of your screen and it will put that image on the screen instead. What show will do is it will create a new layer above the background that displays the image, okay? So layers is something that you might want to become familiar with. If you've used anything like Photoshop in the past, then you'll have an idea of what it is. But essentially what we have is our background layer, which shows our images, and then we can actually put a new image on the top of that. Think of it as a pile of playing cards or a pile of pictures, and we just put, every time we use the show command, we put another image on the top of that pile so it will show it on the screen. Now, it is important to remember that all of the time that you're using the show command, it's putting these images on the screen in a pile. If you were to then try and call or show an image that you'd already showed on the screen previously, with it before you'd cleared that pile of images, then it won't display because it's still there in that pile. It won't bring it to the front. You would have to hide all of the subsequent images in front of it in order to show it. In which case, it's a good idea to use the scene command every now and again to just kind of wipe that pile clean so that you can then start with a fresh pile of images in case you do want to show something again. Now, there are other ways of dealing with that problem, which we'll talk about perhaps in a little while, but for now just bear in mind that when you use the show command, It has to be an image that you haven't already got showing on the image layer, otherwise it'll just stay on whatever part of the pile it's in, okay? Now, onto the storytelling part of it. You'll notice that these lines here are green, and that's because they're encased in quotation marks. Now, the quotation marks tell Ren'Py that there is dialogue to display, and it will show in the dialogue box down at the bottom of the screen whatever text you have displayed or encased inside these quotation marks, okay? Now, we can also change it so that it will be said by a person. If we don't have anything before the quotation marks, it will just show us the dialogue, and it won't have a character saying that dialogue. However, we've got characters S and M, Sylvie and me, defined. So if I was to put an S in front of this line here, then it would be indicated that Sylvie is now the person that's saying that dialogue, and if I put M there, it would show it as being me, okay? And their name will appear in that color. So as you can see, we have our lecture hall BG image there, and we have some music playing, which is the Ilurog.opus, and we have our text appearing here, and it's being said by nobody, so this could be used as narration, okay? Now I'm going to turn my volume down so that you don't have to listen to that music all the way. I think we've heard enough of that through the microphone. Okay, so currently that's what it's showing, and as you can see here, there are 4 lines of dialogue with nobody saying it. So if I click the mouse, those 4 lines will go through, then it will fade. We'll get a scene background uni, which is what this image is, with fade. So this transition fade is actually a default one that Ren'Py has already, so you don't need to define it. You can just say with fade. If you wanted to create your own, we can do that. That's using animation and transform language that we'll talk about a bit further down the line. But essentially, that's what it's doing. So here we go. This is Sylvie Green normal with dissolve again. So she faded into the screen, and she says 3 lines of dialogue, although this is kind of internal monologue dialogue type of thing. And the next thing that's going to happen is it's going to ask me for a choice. As soon as she catches my eye, I decide to ask her later, to ask her right away. Okay, so let's look at what command we're getting there. Menu command. The menu command is a very cool command that allows you to give your player options. Now, they may not be options. You might just want there to be a continue button in your dialogue, so that rather than just clicking through the dialogue, the player has to hit continue. That also makes it easy to block rollback, which is a feature that Ren'Py has that allows the player to use their mouse wheel to roll back to certain lines of dialogue. Different people have different perspectives on that matter. Personally, I don't like rollback. I think it encourages people to just cheat. It's not much of a game if you can remake your choices. I know that people use quick save to do that anyway, but I like to keep the flow of the story going. You remember that you want your choices to have consequences, or at least I do. So again, it's a matter of personal preference. It really is. Okay, so menu. We say menu when we end with that command with a colon, and then we have a line of dialogue. You don't have to have a line of dialogue. You could just have the menu pop up, which would just give the player choices without showing any text. But as you can see, our dialogue window does open, and it says, as soon as she catches my eye, I decide. And then we have our 2 options. When we lay out our menu, we have this quotation mark followed by a colon, which is the text that is going to appear inside the button. Then, after that line, tabbed in one more time, we have whatever code you want to run if they click on that choice. Now, here we've got jump, which we'll talk about in a minute, but you could have literally any code in there. You could have multiple lines of code. You could have an entirely separate game file code literally crammed in there if you wanted to. I wouldn't recommend doing it that way, but that's what you can do. So now we're going to talk about call and jump. So as we've already talked about with my box here, this is a label. Now I've got 2 options if I want to run the code in this label. I can either call it or I can jump to it. If I call it from, let's say I'm inside this piece of code and I want to run this piece of code and then come back to where I left off from this piece of code, I'll use the call command. calling from this label to this label simply says, my command will say call, whatever this label is called, it will run the code within this box, and then it will jump back to where we left off. Jumping to this code from this code will say jump to this code, but it will not then return back to where we left off. It will run this code as if this code were a continuation of wherever we started from on this code. Okay, so think about this as if this is calling is just saying reference to another chapter and then come back once you've done it, and then jump is saying just jump straight to that page in my story, don't bother coming back, we'll just carry on the story from there. Okay, so that is the difference between call and jump. So in this case we've got two jump commands coming out of our menu. We've got ask right away, and then we've got jump to later as well. So right away it will run this code here, and then somewhere down here is later. There you go. We can see that it says label later. I can't get up the nerve to ask her right now with a gulp. I try to ask her later, and then it basically just goes out to, as you can see here, bad ending. However, if we were to ask her now right away, it goes through a series of dialogue which we're going to show now. So we'll go ask her right away. Now you can see that we have a line of dialogue with our character is initial at the front. This is the variable that we've defined as being our character. Sylvie is saying, hi there, how was class? As you can see, and then me, I say good. I can't bring myself to admit, so this is internal dialogue. As you can see, nobody's saying it. Are you going home now? Want to come back with me? And then sure. Then it's going to fade our scene to another image, and then there's some more internal dialogue followed by hey and so on. Okay, so we've carried on with this label. Now if we carry on rattling through, we'll eventually come to another menu which says sure, what's a visual novel, and you can say an interactive book or a video game. And then so if we were to select it's a video game, we come to game, and as you can see now we're carrying on running this piece of code here. And then if we skim through, eventually it will say facial expression has changed, which is show Sylvie Green normal. So all we've done is we've shown a separate image over the top of the previous image, which just has a normal facial expression on it rather than a smile. And then jump, and it jumps to the marry label, which is what's contained within here. As you can see, and a whole bunch of other stuff happens. So we're going to close that down now, because we've already kind of covered the anatomy of what's happening there. All right, so those are the basic fundamentals of the commands that we're going to use at the very beginning. We're going to start off with those things. So I'm going to minimize this window because we don't need it anymore, and we're going to go straight into creating a new project. So back into our Ren'Py file here, create a new project, and it's going to give you a prompt. You can change your launcher language if English is not your native language in the preferences, but we're going to carry on with that, and we're just going to call this Masterclass. You can call it whatever you want to. Then we hit continue, and that's going to ask us for our resolution. Now obviously I'm using a 4K monitor, so my options do expand past 1080p, but you can create it to whatever resolution you want to. I will say one thing about this though. If you're using a reasonably modern computer, by which a computer that was made within the last 10 years, doing it at any lower resolution than 1080p is going to make your game look horrendous. Because what Ren'Py does is it scales up the images based on what screen size you have. So if you were to choose 1280 by 720 and then someone were to play it on a 1080p or a 4K monitor, Ren'Py will automatically scale up all of the content within that window to match the player's screen size. The problem with that is that they become really horrendously blurry and pixelated when it does it. It does the best that it can, but it's not perfect. So if these days the difference between 720p and 1080p is so minuscule that realistically, if you're having to write a visual novel in a 720p resolution, it might be time to buy a new computer, realistically. These days, most game developers are looking to create 4K content because 4K monitors are becoming much more popular. So I'm going to do 1080p purely because it's going to be what I would imagine a number of you are going to be using at the moment, but by all means use whatever screen size you want to. You just have to remember then that when you're creating your game assets and your bits and pieces, that you have to do it at the resolution of your game. Now, I'm going to explain what I just said again. If you choose 1080p, when you create your background images and your sprites and everything for your game, you need to make sure that you create them in 1080p, because that's the size that Ren'Py is going to assume that they are when it renders them onto the screen. So if you're using a 4K monitor and you set up 4K and then you create all of your images at 1080p, they're only going to take up a quarter of the screen, okay? So you need to make sure that your images match the resolution size that you choose. Once we hit continue, we then get to choose color scheme. The color scheme can be whatever you want it to be. I generally stick with black and blue because more often than not I don't use the default colors and things anyway. This is just my starting point. But if you want your game to be one of these color schemes, then by all means just choose which one you want to. That is the color that all of your menus and windows and text and things are going to be. Once you've done that, you hit continue, and then Ren'Py Launcher is going to have a bit of a think and it's going to do some stuff, and then eventually you'll be presented with the window again and the project will have been created, and it will have created a folder on your hard drive inside a folder called Ren'Py Games. Okay, as you can see now, we've got the Masterclass game has now been added to our projects folder, and there are a number of options here, including being able to open the game directory for the game, base image, audio and GUI folders, and then you can edit the script files. Now, if you're using any particular text editor, you can open it beforehand and just open these files. You do not have to access the files through the Ren'Py Launcher. The Ren'Py Launcher just has quick shortcuts to it. So as you can see, using Atom, I have opened the game folder, and now I can browse through my game folder here. I can see my images folder, and it'll show me all of the files that are contained within each folder. And as you can see, we have a number of files here for the question. So now I can just change which folder I'm opening so that I can see the question for the game folder for the game that we just created. And here we go. So when I open this up again, you'll see that there are a number of items contained within our folder. So we're just going to look at these RPY files, okay? RPYC, don't panic about those. If you try and open those, you'll just see a bunch of gobbledygook. That is just the compiled files, so you don't ever need to go into those. Ren'Py Launcher will automatically compile the information within your RPY files and then turn them into RPYC files so that it can run. So let's talk about what we're seeing on the screen in these files. Any file that ends with RPY that is contained within the game folder or a subfolder will automatically be compiled and added to the game file. So think about a book, okay? Let's think about this like a book. Your book has multiple chapters within it. Now you know which order to read the chapters in, because in the West we read from left to right, one page at a time. However, when we are coding, we can write our code files in any order that we want to. But every file that ends with .rpy will be added to our bigger book. So if I want to separate my code into different files, I can do that, and Ren'Py will just smush them all together and run them as if they were one piece of code. So within our GUI.rpy file, you can see that GUI.init 1920 by 1080. So Ren'Py has created this command from what we chose when we set up the project to tell Ren'Py this is the resolution of the game. This is the base resolution of the game. All of the images and sprites and text and so on will be matching that resolution. Init offset -2 is a statement that we use to tell Ren'Py to run this code before most other things. So if we were to have a file within it offset -3, that would be run before this one, and if we had a file within it offset -1, it would be run after this one. And you can do that right from -1,000,000 all the way up to 1,000,000. It's entirely up to you. You can just control which order that these files are run in. And there is a good reason why you would want to do that, okay? If, for example, in this file, I declared a variable, I said define GUI accent color. If in my init offset -3 file, I tried to reference this variable, it would throw an error because this is run after that command would be called. So Ren'Py doesn't know what that variable is yet. If I was to try and run a command that accessed this variable inside init offset -1, it would run because we've now defined it. We've told Ren'Py that's what this variable means, and Ren'Py knows what I'm talking about when I try to reference that variable. So you can see here we've got our GUI resolution set up, and then a whole bunch of colors for different kinds of text. And again, these are all generated when we chose the color scheme for our game when we set it up. So these colors would all equate to various different colors from that color scheme. Then we've got a section that tells us what our text is going to be, our fonts. You can see fonts listed there, and then our text sizes listed there. And each one of these variables will be referenced in other parts of the engine that we will then use. So at the moment we've got a main menu background and a game menu background. They're just image files, that's all they are. And they're the files that will be in the background when we have the main menu come up or the game menu come up. And that is basically everything that's contained within the GUI.rpy file. A bunch of variables that determine how different parts of our game is going to look. So when we come to customizing our game, perhaps in a latter episode, or maybe this one, we'll see how we get on, then we can change those variables. But that's what's in the GUI file. Options.rpy allows us to set another bunch of variables basically. So config.name, so this is the name that is going to appear in our game window and on our main menu. GUI.showName is true, that means that it's going to appear when we call our main menu. So it'll say Masterclass in the bottom right hand corner. Config version, that will appear after the Masterclass name. So if I were to actually run our project, because it does contain some default code, as you can see, Masterclass appears there, and then the version appears below it. And then if we hit start, you can see that it's got the text color for Eileen as blue. You've created a new Ren'Py game. So this is just kind of placeholder code that Ren'Py automatically generates when you create a new game, so that we can start from there and build our game on top of it. Okay, further down you'll see that there's a whole bunch of other variables. Do not worry too much about these at the moment, what they actually mean and what they are. Just be aware that that's what's in there. The next bit of moderate interest is this bit that says build.classify. Build.classify means that when Ren'Py is compiled, when you finish writing your game and you want to distribute it to other people, it will compile it all into a playable file format, and it will put all of the data, all of the images, all of the sounds, music, and so on will get compressed into what is essentially a zip file known as an RPA file. Okay, and what we're doing in this section of the video is we're telling Ren'Py these files, the ones with these, I want to not be put into the distribution. So we're saying don't put a backup file or thumbs database file into my .rpa file because we don't need them. Okay, and we can say to add things to our game file as well. So for example, in our .archive here, you can see that there's a couple of lines here that have been commented out where we've changed from none, because it's the none bit that tells us not to do it, and we've said archive here. Okay, so yeah, don't stress too much about what that means right now. Just be aware that that's what's happening inside the options.rpy file. The next file is our screens.rpy file, and as you can see, init offset is -1. Our options doesn't have an init offset, but our GUI has an init offset of -2. So these variables must be declared before we run this code. Okay, now you can see a whole bunch of styles. Styles is a bit like text tagging. Okay, so if you've ever created a website, or if you ever wonder how websites are created, you normally have a file that contains all of the raw information that you're going to put on that file, and then you have style sheets that enable you to determine how that information is going to be displayed on a screen. This is essentially the same thing. Okay, so we won't worry too much about it just now, but suffice to say that each one of these styles basically is the code that's going to tell our code Ren'Py what we want our different elements of our screen to look like. And we can play with these when we're customizing our graphical user interface a bit further down the line. But there are a number of screens determined down below. These are defined. So screen say, this is our first one. I'm going to just, that is all of our say screen code in a oneer. Okay, because Ren'Py does a lot of the heavy lifting for us, all we have to do is say what character we want to say something and then what they want to say, i.e. who and what. Style prefixes say, that's just our way of telling Ren'Py that all of the elements below will have a style sheet associated with them and the prefix will be say. So if we come down here, say label, say dialogue, and say thought. So all of those things, it will automatically apply to the elements of the screen based on what they are. So window is the dialog box. Complicated stuff, I know. ID window. So we're saying that this window has got an ID of window. If we were then to try and have another window with the same ID and we call that window, this one would hide. So we're basically making it so that we can't have multiple windows on the screen. Okay, so this is an actual conditional statement. So if you remember from when we ran the code prior for the question, the dialogue that didn't have anybody saying it still appeared on the screen, but it didn't have a name box. That's what this command is doing. We're saying if the person saying it is not none, then we're going to display the name box, which is what this is, which is just a box, which has a style name box and the text is who, like that. However, if that is not the case, it won't display it. So if there's nobody saying anything, it won't even bother putting the name box on the screen because there's nothing to put in it, so it would be a waste of time. And then it's saying inside our window, inside our dialog box, it's saying what they're saying. Basically, that's the dialogue. And then there's a whole bunch of more styles which are used in that say screen. Sorry, frog in my throat. Terrible. And then we come to various different other screens. So currently, all of our screens are defined inside this one file, which for simplicity's sake is fine, but personally I tend to break this up into multiple files, and as I said again, you can do that. If I were to cut half of this file out and paste it into another RPY file, it would still work just fine, because it's just going to take all of my RPY files and smush them together in one big file. Nice and simple, yeah? So we're not going to go too in depth in the screens file now. We'll come back and look at all of that gobbins a bit later on. But for now, we're going to look at our script file. Okay, so some of these commands might look a bit familiar to you from when we defined our characters in the question game. So the very first question, or the very first command, is define E character Eileen. So all we're doing is saying that when we use the letter E in front of a line of dialogue, it's going to be the character Eileen who's saying it. Now, when you define anything, when you do anything like this in Ren'Py or Python or any other programming language, make sure you get the capitalization correct. Character begins with a big C. Doesn't matter what you call the character, that doesn't have to be case sensitive because that is a string of text. It's just words that are going to be put on the screen. But when we're talking about actual variable definitions and types and things like that, and commands all have to be case sensitive. So make sure define has a lowercase d, character has an uppercase C. Now you'll notice that these grayed out bits of text here, they all begin with hash. So they are notes. We can make notes in our code files just by using the hash. So anything that's after that can just be whatever you want it to be. Ren'Py will ignore those lines of code and just move on to the next one. This means that we can annotate our code to remind ourselves of what's going on. I'm terrible for this. I always forget to do it, but you have to bear in mind that even if you're an independent game developer, that doesn't necessarily mean that somewhere further down the line, someone else isn't going to pick up your code and finish it. If you get hit by a bus, or if you sell your game to somebody else to finish or whatever, you need to make sure that you annotate your code file sufficiently so that someone looking at it doesn't have to spend hours reverse engineering your code to figure out what it's doing. You should just be able to figure it out straight away, okay? So we've defined our character Eileen, and then we call label start. Now label start is one that is automatically called by Ren'Py when you hit the start button in the main menu. it's how we got to here. So this is what's actually being done within the start label, but we got there just by going from start. Hit start and it calls the start label, okay? Do not try and get different labels to run from the main menu at this point in time, okay? We'll deal with how you can actually accomplish that a bit later on in the series, but for now we're going to just work with what we've got, okay? So if you remember, scene, BG room, and show Eileen happy. So scene, we clear the screen down to nothing, and we're going to put in the background our image file, BG room. Then on top of that, we're going to show Eileen happy, which is what is going on here. So BG room is our background image, Eileen happy is here, and it uses this placeholder image of a silhouette of a anime girl to tell us that that image doesn't exist, okay? So it's saying, I don't know what you're wanting me to show, but it doesn't exist, okay? Then we've got our 2 lines of dialogue and then return. Return is how we denote the end of a label. So if we had multiple labels, this would be our way of separating them, okay? So let's just have a little bit of a play, and I'm going to create another label, and I'm going to call this finish, okay? And we have to remember to declare it as label finish, and it's going to be case sensitive, so I'm going to change my first letter, my F, to a small f, so that I know that I'm going to be all right further down the line. Then we terminate that line with a colon, and when we hit enter, it should automatically tab us. If we try to write that code on that line, as in the first line, the first character of that line, it won't run because it needs to be tabbed in for Ren'Py to be able to recognize that the code that follows is actually contained within this label. Okay, so make sure you get your tabbing right. Tabbing is usually one of the bigger problems that new people tend to face when they start coding with Python or Ren'Py, is that they forget to make sure their tabs are correct, and it just leads to all kinds of shenanigans, okay? So all I'm going to do in my label finish is put return, and then I'm going to take this bit away, like so, and we're going to see what happens, okay? So I've removed my return from the end of label start, and I'm actually going to put another line of dialogue in here so that we can see what's happening. This is the finish label, like that. So Eileen's going to say that when we go into the finish label. So as you can see, I've removed the return statement from the end of my start label. So if I were now to go to reload my script, I click and it immediately just automatically rolls from this line into this line, okay? So we haven't told Ren'Py that the end of that label is here. So if I was to put return there, and then I were to rerun my code from the beginning, let's just come back to the main menu, hit start, create a new Ren'Py game. Once you add story, pictures, and music, you can release it to the world. Then we click, and now the game ends. So now Ren'Py knows that this label is actually finished, and it won't go into here. What I can do though, if I do still want to show my this is your finish label, I can just say jump finish. Now when I run my code, back from the start, you've created a new Ren'Py game. Once you add pictures, music, you can release it to the world. This is the finish label, and then it will end the game. Okay, so now it gets to here, then we say jump to the finish label, so it's going to jump over this return statement. It's going to ignore that one now and come straight to here. It'll run this line of code, and then it will take this return statement instead, and it will assume that this is the end of our game. Okay, so we literally just jump over that to there, and then it will carry on as if this line never existed. Okay, so that's nice and simple. Nice and simple. Now let's throw in some more options. Yeah, shall we say? Let's give ourselves a menu. So we'll go with menu. Now, if you remember from our previous game, the question, we now have to put some text on the screen to actually say to the player what they have to do. So I'm just going to put in quotation marks. I'm not going to have anybody saying anything here, but I could put Eileen saying it if I wanted to, but I'm going to just skip that bit. And we're going to say, what do you want to do? Question mark, colon. Okay, remember to use the colon disgusting as that sounds, if you don't put it in there, it will throw up an error. In fact, I stand corrected. No, it won't. We don't use the end, we don't use the colon at the end of that line. We use the colon at the end of excuse me, frog in my throat, terrible today. At the end of the lines of choice. So we're going to say start again. Now we put in our colon and we're going to say jump start. And the next command is going to be finish, spelled correctly, colon. And then I'm going to take this line of code and move it to there. And then we can actually get rid of this return statement now because we don't actually have any other option. We've given the menu, the player, two choices to either come back to the beginning here or to jump to here. There is no way that they can continue past this menu. If we had a third option that didn't have a jump statement in it, then we would need to think about our situation. But currently, let's have a look at what we've got. You've created a new Ren'Py game, blah, blah, blah. Now it's giving me two choices, start again and finish. If I click start, it comes back to the beginning and just comes straight back to that question again. If I hit finish, it jumps to the finish label and then ends the game because we hit our return statement, yeah? Now, note, return does not mean end the game. Return means end the label, right? So if I were to have various different kind of statements going on, for example, if I were to change my statement to call instead, I'll put a return here again just to make sure I don't have any problems. Now if I go jump start but I go call finish, and I will put another line of text here just so that we know what's going on. E, and I'm going to put, this is a start label again. I'm going to save that, come back to my game. It's auto refreshing because I've used Shift and R. Now if I hit start, it comes up with my menu, and if I go start again, it will jump back to the beginning because we're using a jump statement there. Now if I hit finish, it will say this is the finish label, but because I've used call, it will run this label, then it will come back to here again. So when I click the mouse again, you can see this is the start label again, and then it hits the final return statement and it ends the game. Okay, so as you can see, this is kind of like what we would call, this is a bit like Russian nesting dolls. What's happening is I'm calling this bit of code, which is ended by return, to tell Ren'Py return to where we came from, and then it will carry on from where we left off. So I can do that as many times as I want. I can have as many nests as I want to. It's just going to keep on working, okay? So at this point, I would recommend pausing the video and having a bit of play with the stuff that we've learned so far about how to define characters, how to write dialogue, and how to provide the character or the player with options. With everything we've learned so far, you could actually write an entire visual novel with different paths and different options to choose from, displaying different images. You could completely fine to write an entire visual novel with that. In fact, I've played many visual novels that do comprise of just that kind of stuff. You'll have as many labels as you need to create different passages through the game. So for example, instead of having our options start again and finish, we could have turn left or turn right, and then we would have labels for turn left and turn right, which might then lead off down other paths and call different labels, and you can end up with a massive game with many different endings, just by using the stuff that we've learned so far. So if that's what you want to do and you don't want to go any further and learn any more advanced stuff, then that's great. Crack on and good luck creating your game. But for those of us who want to go a little bit further and try with more advanced stuff, pause the game, have a bit of a play, get used to the stuff that we've discussed so far, and then we'll move on to the next bit. So the next bit we're going to talk about is variables, okay? We've already kind of covered them a little bit, but think about a variable as a container. So again, we can come back and we can talk about them as if they're a box, okay? Now, one of the things that Python does differently to other programming languages is that the variables are not typed. What I mean is that if I tell you that this box is a variable, this box can contain anything I want it to contain. It could be a number, it could be a letter, it could be a word, it could be a list of things, it can be whatever I want it to, and I don't have to tell Python beforehand what it is, unless I try and reference it, and we'll come to that in a minute. Whereas in other programming languages such as C#, you would have to say to C#'s compiler, this is variable box, it contains integers, or it contains strings, or whatever. You have to tell it what kind of type it's going to be. So the beauty of Python is we don't have to do that. For example, we've defined variable e, and its value is a character called Eileen. So if I wanted to, I could say define number 1 equals 1. Okay, so I've just created a variable, the value of which is the integer 1. Okay, and there are various different types, so we need to make sure we spell define correctly, otherwise it's going to throw an error. Bool 1 equals true or false. So there's a variable. The name I've given the variable is completely arbitrary. I could have called that sausage 1 if I'd wanted to, or supercalifragilisticexpialidocious, and given it the value of true. Python will know, okay, that value of whatever he's named it is a Boolean variable with the value of true. We can do the same thing for define carburetor. I'm not sure if I spelled that correctly or not. And then we can just call that string. So now we've told Python that is a string of text, basically. And a string of text is just some words that, an arbitrarily long list of words that we can then put on the screen. So let's do that later on, perhaps. So yeah, variables are really useful. Now you might be wondering, what's the point? Why don't I just put into my game 1 or true or part of a car? It's a valid question. Certainly when I first started programming out decades ago, I would have asked the same question. And the reason is that I might want this to change. So for example, let's talk about it as if it were a first-person shooter, okay? Your first-person shooter, you've got player hit points. Okay, so player hit points like that equals, let's just say it's 100, okay? I might, further down the line, might want to say if I take a bullet, that number is decreased. Now, if I was to put into my code that I want to display the hit points on the screen, for example, or if the player's hit points drops below 0, you die, I need a variable to be able to do that, because I can change the variable value, hence the name variable. Whereas if I just keep putting in the number 100 every time, the player will never die, because that number is never going to change. The game doesn't know, the game engine doesn't know that that number is less or more dependent on a number of criteria, because it's just a number. Whereas with a variable, I can add, subtract, multiply, divide, whatever, a number of mathematical functions I can use on that variable, and the value contained within it will change, so that I can use that to determine whether the player lives, dies, gets a bonus, or whatever. So those eagle-eyed among you will have already noticed that I've made a deliberate mistake. So what we've done is we're not using the proper method of doing this. So what we should be saying is default instead of define. We should be using default for variables that will change, and define for variables that won't. We're saying default, default, change your leaves to default, like so. Remembering to save our code, and now we're doing things properly. So when we say number 1 plus equals 1, now we'll get our variables coming in. Okay, so remember to use default and define correctly. It's kind of like there, and there, to make sure that you're doing things the right way. Okay, now in more modern versions of Python you might get away with it, but just don't take the risk of ending up having to go write hours and hours of code. Okay, so we can also use this information to determine the name of a character. So for example, let's just say default player underscore name equals Dave. Now if I want to reference that variable, I need to use square brackets and then just put player name in there, and then I run my code. As you can see, you've created a new Ren'Py game, full stop Dave, and that's because I'm an idiot and I didn't put a space in there to format the text. But that's essentially how we can do that, so that we can actually have a player name using the input screen at the beginning of the game, and then we can actually just refer to the player by their name throughout the course of the game running. So for those of you who want to give the player the opportunity to put their name into the game, that would be how you would reference it. Now, of course, we actually need to take in the player name, so we're going to need to use the input screen for that. So what we're going to do is we're going to do that by, let's just say, before we do anything else, we're going to get rid of this line because we don't need it. We're still going to use a pound or dollar symbol to denote that we're about to enter some code. And what we're going to do is we're going to say player underscore name equals renpy.input. So what we're doing is we're using a Pythonic command to say renpy.input, and now we need to open some brackets, and we're going to say what is your name, question mark, and we'll add a capital W just because it's the start of a sentence. And we can even set the maximum length of this to be, let's say, 15 characters or whatever, or we can just leave it like that. It doesn't actually matter. Okay. And then, so now we can run that command again. We'll make sure we save our code, and we're going to see what happens. There we go, start. So the first thing we're going to say is, what is your name? Let's just say Barry McBarry. Hit enter, and there you go. You've created a new Ren'Py game, Barry McBarry. So what we've done is we've already declared that the player name variable is Dave as a string. However, if we go for this variable where we've said player name equals renpy.input what is your name, essentially what we've now said is that that variable is now going to change to whatever the player types. Now, there are ways and means of us changing this to make sure that if the player just hits enter, it will be the default name, but we'll cross that bridge perhaps later on. But for now, you now know how to get the player to enter their name that you can use further down the line when you recall wanting to use their name, basically. So we've already covered some pretty cool stuff in terms of how to use Ren'Py in its most basic form, and as I said before, I highly encourage you at this point to stop or pause the video, go and have a bit of a play with the things that we've done so far before we go on to anything more complicated. Okay, it's a really good idea to get to grips with the concepts that we've learned so far before trying to do anything more advanced, because if you try and copy and paste code or do things like trying to learn to run before you can walk, you are going to land flat on your face, and you'll be sat there for weeks trying to figure out how your code works and how to bug find your code. I would argue, and this is not meant to be disrespectful to anybody, probably 90% of the comments of people asking questions are because they've either copy pasted code and they don't know how the hell the code actually works, and they've hit a snag, or they've not typed something in properly. In fact, I would say probably 90% of those people are typos. People who just put spaces in the wrong place, haven't put tabs in, capitalized something they shouldn't have. It's a very, very common error. And as I say, the other percentage of those people are the people who've not bothered learning how the programming language actually works. They've just copy pasted the code from my video, and then immediately as soon as they hit a snag, they don't know what the hell to do. So again, spend some time, familiarize yourself with this code. I'm actually going to split this video into several videos just so that it's easier to follow, but this is going to be the end of that first part of the masterclass. Okay, thanks very much for watching that, guys. I hope you found it useful. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and I will see you in the next one. But until then, you take damn good care of yourselves. All right, bye bye.